Okay, in this talk, I'm going to answer the questions that I received from the Google form about the field research for those students who got it done on time. I got 23 responses, and actually quite a few students that don't have any questions. So for those of you who have questions, what I've done is I've kind of taken the ones that were representative. So some of them, there's a couple questions I'm looking at right now, where somebody else asked a very similar question, so I'm going to answer kind of both of those questions using their example. So I think just to kind of give you a basic introduction to this idea is that, like when you're a kid, like say 8 years old, this is how you start basically all of your research. You have a curiosity. And so we're using the word inquiry. It's the same idea. So you want to know more about something. And so the first thing you do, let's say you want to know more about blocks, right? And you've got your blocks, your friend's blocks, and then these new blocks that you got, as a present. So you want to see first what are the similarities of your blocks, and then what are the differences. And so you gather all of those materials, and that's what we call field research. One thing I think many of you are struggling with is the fact that from about 8 years old till now, you've been collecting data that has already been collected for you. To be blunt, I have no idea other than maybe the sheer laziness of the educational system, why we continue to teach you that skill over and over and over again. It's certainly something you need to learn how to do, and it's called synthesis, to take stuff that has already been written, to understand it, and then use it to apply to new problems. The issue is it seems like that's not happening, at least in my experience in higher education for a little over 10 years now. So one thing that I'm trying to do through this class, because one of the learning outcomes is about research, is to break it down into little pieces and really narrow in on what is the difficulty. So what I'm seeing the difficulty is, you have to, it's good, right? Start out just like you were when you were 8. You gather a bunch of information, and then you separate it, right? You say, here are the blocks I like, here are the blocks that aren't very good for me. And keep those things separate. So I found some research, it's really helpful. I found some other research, it's not so helpful. I'm going to keep it over here. I'm not going to include it, although I may use it, let's say, in the conclusion. But then you need to construct some kind of experiment. And this is where social science comes in, right? So the difference between being an 8-year-old to a high school student is that you weren't expected to produce any knowledge. You were simply repeating something that somebody told you. And that's not what you do in college for the most part. And it's certainly not what you do when you transfer. So by the time you become a junior and senior, you're being asked to create new information. And so what you have to do is construct some kind of an experiment, and we call this field research, and kind of like common sense in a way, right? You're going to do your research in the field. You're not going to do it in the library. You're not going to do it by just looking at websites. You're not going to be doing it just by looking at things that people have already said and copying that down. I might just put in like a big red flag here. That's called plagiarism. And it's a strange thing that a lot of teachers have taught you how to plagiarize. And probably you get in trouble for it in classes and get graded down without ever even knowing. Largely because some teachers use electronic software that basically says, well, this isn't new content that the student came up with. So this is like the big difficulty I think most of you are having based on conversations and based on just looking at your work. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is really break it down into little tiny steps so that you can see exactly what you're doing. And then I'm going to put up kind of a play-by-play, step-by-step process on the website as well, so that you can kind of just follow those instructions, right? So a lot of education is learning a new process. It's learning how to do something. So if it's not comfortable for you, you're probably learning. In fact, I would say I guarantee you're learning. Now, do you understand what you're learning? Maybe not. And this is the kind of difficulty of education in this particular environment. And so that's why we're kind of going through this process the way we are. So just like real quick, a lot of you, I mean, I said this in 2 other presentations, so I have to either assume that you didn't watch those of you who kind of keep asking these same questions, or it's just not sinking in. So, if you're trying to write the whole paper in one sitting, you're not going to pass. I mean, I don't know how to say it any other way. And if you've done that before, what you've done is you've practiced a really bad habit. And so, it's any teacher who is worth the amount of money that we're getting paid is going to not see that as a quality paper, because there's no possible way that you could have put much thought into it. And all you must have been doing is gathering information, copying it, and pasting it. Or you wrote what's called streams of consciousness, which if you want to go back in time and be a 1950s beatnik poet is great. But, in the age of 2020, it's just not a helpful thing to just blurt out every single idea that's in your head without organizing it at all. So when you look at the page count, right, 5 pages with a table. So the table is the tool that organizes the information. And you'll notice that like the grading rubric is a table, right? And so it organizes the information on the left-hand column. These are the things that you have to do. Now, how you do them are the rows, right? So if you do them well, then you can get an A. If you do them kind of well, right, you're struggling, you're trying to figure it out, then you can get a B. And if you don't do them well at all, you're going to get a C minus. And, just to kind of repeat something I've said before, that grade does not transfer to John Jay. And so you'd have to take the class again. And what I'm saying here is that if you're in this category, then you are not showing college level work. You're showing that you are not capable of moving on to the next level. And so you don't deserve to get an A or a B. I mean, just to put it as bluntly as I possibly can. But what this rubric also does, what this table does, is show you what you need to do to be able to get a B or A. And then I'm going to say this a few times. If you don't understand these instructions, we need to be talking to each other. And that's the only way it's going to work. So this is the kind of just overview. If you look at the sections of the paper, then to me, right, we're in B and C. That's what you're looking at right now. So the first thing you have to do is gather your articles, gather the UN reports, gather whatever field research you're doing, and then start the process of a narrative analysis. And what this is like literally you're going to analyze the words that people are using. So don't make it more complicated than it is. Just write down what they said and then analyze it, right? You're saying, so what does this word mean to this person? And how is this going to affect the solution they're proposing? So kind of just like a simple like argument here, right? Is like you've identified an injustice and it's important to you. But I'm sure you're aware it's not important to everyone. And, the issue here is because like you're looking at it a certain way. Other people are going to look at it differently. So you need to be able to speak their language, so to speak. So when we think about human rights, sure, they're universal because we're all humans and we all want rights. But how they're interpreted really depends on the point of view of different people in different groups. So you're going to make an argument with the understanding that you're not arguing to yourself. You're arguing to somebody else who has a different point of view than you. And so the law, right, has 3 dimensions or 3 components. It's got the institution, which are rules, and here we're learning the federal rules of evidence and the formal rules of logic. You've got the venue choice as this instrument of law that you're going to use. Are you advocating for a piece of legislation to be drafted? Are you advocating for a conference to be held and for all the countries to talk about this issue? Are you advocating for a lawsuit to be filed, right? These are the kind of big questions that you'd want to be able to answer in Section B. And then you want to think about this ideology, and ideology is the mental model of the people who are involved. This is what we're talking about as far as like the point of view that they have and the language they use. There's no other way of knowing what their point of view is, right? Like if they don't tell you, then you don't know what they think. Just like if you don't write things down on your paper, I have no idea of knowing what's in your brain. But the language that you use tells me very clearly whether you understand what we're talking about in the shared language of human rights, or if you're still viewing it from a different point of view, say like criminology Then method 2, right, the C is where you're going to be building off of this, and this is where you put together your table. Now, if you don't do a table, right, because a table is something that, you can take a bunch of information and put it into a very small amount of space, then you're going to have to explain it, and that's going to take at least 3 pages. So, I don't prefer that. I think you should put it into a table. It's so much easier, and it's a good skill to learn how to do. It's a thing that you're going to be asked to do again. It's also good for your brain. But the other side of this is if you can't do it, if you're just struggling with it, then you're going to go back to explaining it. Now, again, you have to be careful, right? Because writing it out, you have to make sure that you're really super clear. And that's the idea. A lot of you got into this bad habit of trying to fill pages. So you see an assignment that says, it's 11 pages, and you've got 9 pages of pure nonsense. And it's because you're just throwing stuff in there. You're just adding things. You're giving every example that you can possibly think of. And again, that's not a good paper. So I'm really looking at the quality of your work. And once you get your draft in, then I can give you feedback and you can work on D, E, and F. So that's kind of the main kind of idea here. Now, in order to do this properly, right, I have to assume that you remember the information that you've gathered so far in this class and that you've been paying attention, that you've done the 2 articles, the reading of the 2 articles that I've given you. You've read the legal cases. You've watched the YouTube videos, and that, you more or less have like a general idea of what's going on. So you did this activity, and this is one of those things. I was teaching you how to do a process by drawing out the actor network theory. And you drew it out really well. Almost all of you did it perfectly. So it's not more complicated. I mean, lots of people like to make things more complicated than they need to be. Don't, right? Not in the time of COVID pandemic. When we all get back together, you can make things as complicated as you want. But for now, right, you just have to think about it's really super simple. So I drew it out for you here on this slide. Like, there's me right in the middle, right? Just like you, the same thing we did before. Then there's my neighborhood. And I'm not so interested in the neighborhood, right? I'm interested in the people in the neighborhood. I'm not going to go out and talk to the street about trying to make social change. The street isn't going to have anything to say to me. I am going to talk to people who are on the street, right? Because they're my neighbors. They're going to be the easiest people I can talk to. I usually see them, 2-3 times a week, if not more. Then there are city representatives, and some of them might be my neighbors, right? And I don't know. So I'd have to do some research, and I'd find out where are these city representatives. And then we just keep extending. Then there's state representatives. Then there's global representatives, right? So these organizations that you're reaching up, right? The United Nations, for me, is just on the other side of Central Park. That's my neighbor practically, right? So if I walk over there, I'm bound to meet people from the United Nations who can help me on this project. Now, depending on your neighborhood, and this is something you really want to think about, right? There might be people in your neighborhood, let's say East New York, okay, where there's an injustice, a very clear injustice, or East Flatbush, right? And yet the people that you need to talk to are up in the Upper East Side in Manhattan. That's a big distance. So you're going to have to think about a way to connect to these people, the people who are being harmed by the injustice and the people who can implement the solution. You also want to think about who are the community organizations nearby, okay? The people who are closest to a problem are the ones who are going to have the best solutions. The further away they are, what could they possibly know about the problem in East New York, or the problem in South Brooklyn, or the problem in the Bronx, right? How are they going to know? This is why a lot of you, when you're doing your research, have these like wildly general, abstract statements like, well, we're going to bring the whole world together. We're going to bring the whole world together where? Right? Because we're already in the world together, and that doesn't seem to be solving the problem. So, we have to be much more concrete about who are the people we're talking about. And that's what actor network theory does, right? So once you've identified what the cause of the injustice is, right, and as narrow as you possibly can, then you want to say who has solutions for this problem and how close are they to the problem. Then who needs to be organized to enact the solution? That's why I put all humans on there, right? I mean, we can't forget certain people. So like one group I've been working with about homelessness, who almost always gets forgotten in the conversation about homelessness is homeless people. Now, how can you solve the problem of homelessness without talking to homeless people? How can you solve the problem of migration without talking to people who migrate? How can you solve the problem of life underwater, pollution, things like that, without talking to the polluters, without talking to the scientists? You got to bring these people in, and that's kind of this very first section, you have to be clear about who you're talking to. Now, then you have to think about whose rights are being involved, right? So especially like in unequal education, right? Are these rights mostly affecting girls? Usually that is the case in education, that girls are the ones that are getting held back. So now you're thinking, wait a second. So the people of the solutions are not the same people as the people who need the rights. So now we have to place those people on our map and say, okay, how are we going to have a conversation with these folks? And then what girls, right? All girls, rich little white girls, they're having a hard time getting education? I doubt it, right? So you need to be like super specific and then start to narrow in on a geography. You're not going to give all girls a quality education in the world by next year. And not even by the next 25 years, right? So you need to be like really concrete. I'm going to make sure that all girls in, Sheepshead Bay have a quality education by the year 2030. That is achievable. And then which court is the best for this claim? And if the court, right, the court is the place that enforces the law. The court is the place that administers the law. The court is the place that orders the law, right? The court is this like location where you can enforce the law in a place where it hasn't been enforced. And this is the whole point of having a court. But, if I'm trying to solve a problem in Nigeria, I don't think I'm going to go to the small claims court in New York City, right? I would probably want to look either for an international human rights court. That might be the right thing to do. Or I might want to look at a federal court. And I might say, okay, the United States is violating rights in Nigeria by arming people in Somalia. And that those weapons then get sold to groups in Nigeria who then are using them for violence, right? So you see kind of how this network works, right? This idea that we're all separate from each other is an amazing new Republican fantasy, but it's just not reality. And I think the pandemic has made this like super clear, right? So humans interact with each other not just face to face, but also through the things they buy. I mean, just think about all the things you buy. Where do they come from? And then where were the materials? Where'd those come from, right? Everything's made everywhere now. People are making things in different countries, but the materials come from this other country, and so et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might be surprised that some of the pieces in your cell phone came from Nigeria. And so when you make a purchase for a cell phone, you're actually having an effect, and you're affecting the rights of other people. So the venue, the choice of the court, could be international, it could be national. And then for those of you looking here in New York City, it's probably going to be a city court or a state court. But this is the idea, is that the judge is going to say to you, why should I care? Why should we care? Why does this affect our rights? So then where do you fit in, and what can you do? Well, you can make the case, right? You can use your legal knowledge that you're getting from this class to make a good legal argument in court for why such and such thing needs to happen in such and such place. And that's what this whole kind of thing is about. So let's start with some of the questions. So how will I connect the federal rules of evidence along with the Supreme Court cases to poverty in Nigeria? Well, this is interesting, right? Because the question just is back to you, is you have to be able to convince the court. How do you know the evidence is reliable? Let's say you're getting a bunch of information about Nigeria, but I think we've all gotten an email that says, the Nigerian prince has been deposed. Please send $5,000 to such and such place. Or more recently, the president of this country, suggested people inject, bleach. So how is the information credible? Now, in both those cases, they're taking information and churning it. They're changing the information to sound better to people, even though it's not even close to what the experts had said. So one rule you could use, and there's three that come into mind, right? The one I use in my paper that you look at is relevance. Is it relevant? Now, obviously, the information you're going to be bringing from Nigeria about Nigeria is relevant, so that's why I'm not really including that here. But the big question is going to be hearsay. So is this like a journalist went to Nigeria and is reporting about something? Because that's hearsay. That's not going to be admissible into court unless you get the journalist to come in and testify. So this is the big issue, is you want to start thinking, I think the other area you'd want to look at is the expert witness. It'd probably be better if you can get an expert witness to say, this is the problem, this is the injustice in Nigeria, and then you might want to bring in, let's say, a UN, look at the UN reports and say, I'd like to bring in this ambassador or this, researcher who did research for the UN into the court and present this case. So that's why I put this, the rule of hearsay. So you want to go back to the video on the federal rules of evidence. Now, I like this one because this is field research, right? Can I use personal experience from things I've seen when traveling to Mexico? Yes, of course. So in my own research, for example, and I give you two examples here. This is Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, both comparative anthropologists that went around and they were trying to learn things about Western culture by examining other cultures. So, I did a field research project in 2011. I went to Guatemala to study an immigration case. And, what I saw there, I took insane amount of notes. Right? I took pictures, I took video, I had audio interviews, right? All that data I'm now organizing and analyzing for a book project. So this is not just like a good way of doing research, it's extremely common. And it's one of the preferred ways of doing research because we go back to the first, the slide right before is like, how do I know that the information is valid? Well, it's much easier if you're the one who sees it and collects the information because you're going to be testifying in court. You're the one who says, I'm not getting this from somebody else. This isn't hearsay. This is my direct experience. Now, here's the weird thing, right? And this is another one of those challenges for me. This is a law class. You're learning legal knowledge. Some of you are thinking, wait a second, in my English class or, some other class, they said not to speak from personal experience. Let me give you two ideas here. The first one is I just think they're wrong. I think they're operating under a very old way of thinking. Look, they're going to be gone and not too many teachers are going to say things like that anymore. Most of them are not saying that anymore. But let's say for a second that I want to buy their argument. They say, well, it's not rigorous enough. You're biased and, there's limits to your point of view. Yeah, but that's also true of anyone else's research. So, if you're reading John Locke or you're reading Jean Rousseau or you're reading some other person, they were biased. They have limits of their point of view. And we have no idea what kind of rigor they went through. I'm not sure what kind, rigor is like how much work and effort you put into it. It's like, how could I possibly know that about these dead people? It's not a good argument simply because, it applies to every human being. So what you want to do is just acknowledge. You're not trying to your evidence from Mexico is going to be from a particular place or a set of places. You're not trying to say this is applicable to all human beings in Mexico. So that's all you do. You just say, look, I know about this thing. This is what I was looking for. Here's what I found. And this is what I think. And then that's the best way to kind of produce that kind of knowledge. And again, that's common in sociology and anthropology, in criminology. I mean, lots of people in the 1700s had all sorts of things to say about crime. And then people in the 1950s started saying, why don't we start asking people who are in prison about crime? And guess what? The stories were completely different. And so, I think that's the big issue is the people who are closest to the problem are going to have the best information and they're going to be the most reliable. And that's who's going to be allowed to talk in court. I like this one because it is a good question, but I want to just highlight this same problem at the same time, right? How the way we talk influences our research. So you say combat school violence, right? Combat, of course, is a violent term. And so you should think about that for a second because this is when we're analyzing the ideology and the language, right? You're taking violent language to analyze violence, and that's going to be the biggest problem with this kind of a research. So if you're trying to dive deeper, then, how you ask the question is going to give you options. So if you're looking at combating violence, that's a violent metaphor for violence. You're going to be limited, right? There's not going to be too many thinkers. They're going to have probably the one I give you here is surveillance, right? But on the other hand, right, you want to think more about peace. I mean, isn't it strange, right, that at some schools there are no violence? And I'm being facetious there. It was strange. It's not strange, right? If you look at Harvard, they have information for employees about domestic violence. NYU has programs for people to combat, see, I just did it. to deal with violence, right? And to resolve violence. And so the question I'm saying is like, where are the peace studies, right? I promise you at institutions, at high schools, at elementary schools, and communities where they're focusing on peace, they're going to have less violence. And I think this is the main issue is like, peaceful people are going to be peaceful. Violent people are going to be violent. If you're in a place that's violent, I don't see how you're going to deal with the violence in that area without starting a process for peace. And so that's what you want to look at. And one kind of good example is upeace.org. But also another place is Facing History. You can Google that and you can find examples like the Parkland one here. You have to have peaceful people have to stand up and start advocating for their rights. And a lot of these kids from Parkland actually went to court. So, this is a pretty good example if you wanted to use Newtown or Parkland, I think. Or you could go back to when I was in high school, Columbine was a big issue there. So, I think this is the big question here is like, how can you get education for peace into the high schools, especially if you think about like these terrible things that happen, to us when in junior high and high school with cliques and, groups and, just people being pretty awful. So it's like, it's not surprising when somebody is like teased and tormented and sometimes physically abused that they turn to violence. And lots of studies, FBI studies, for example, have shown that like violent offenders tend to have had violence in their lives and had been violently abused by their families. So, you have to have this place that's going to kind of deal with violence in a peaceful way and teach people conflict resolution. Now, this is kind of a good question because this means you're trying to apply the readings. And so this is harder to answer, right? Because this is a choice you have to make. If you look at my paper, and of course you can all borrow things I say in the paper, that was kind of the point. But like I started like here, if you look on the right-hand side, I'm just introducing this idea. It's like, okay, if I want to get action on climate change and action on peace, then, we're talking about education. And the big problem with education is that the people I need to educate are the people who are misinformed because of what they see on television and the news. So I start with CSI thinking as wishful, or CSI science as wishful thinking, to show that that's what I have to deal with. That's what I have to show in court is a new way of thinking about things. So I have to kind of try to talk in a way that meets people's expectations while at the same time kind of bringing them back down to earth. But you also need to read The Basketball and the Key of Law. And there's lots of things in this article that will show you like how to structure your argument. So especially in the conclusion, you're going to want to link up section B and the conclusion. And I start to do that, and I got to finish my refugee documentary, and then I have to watch a climate change documentary, and then I'll finish my paper. But I start to do that in my paper where I show at the beginning what I'm trying to do, and then what I'm going to use is what the key of law. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, but. This is really about the structure of your argument. So this is where that outline is really helpful. And you just don't a lot of you are trying to get each section done before you move to the next section. I didn't do that. If you look at my paper example, I started each section. And because that means I want to try to strengthen the places in between to make them kind of flow together. And that's what you should do. And that's the choices you have to make. And that's, you're not going to get graded on the choices you make, right? Those are going to be ways that you're choosing to evidence your understanding. And that's the part where I think some of you who have been writing papers as if it was a list of ingredients to bake a cake, this is a little bit harder for you. But, it's better that you go through this now than when you transfer. And again, we can talk about it. So, you're not alone. And then location, like where to put things in your paper. My preference would be, if you go back to the outline, is put them where I told you to put them. And then it's always better to put them at the beginning of each section, right? So put the articles, put the cases up at the beginning of the section, put the federal rules of evidence at the beginning of the section, and then explain why you're using it. This question is challenging to me as an educator. Partially because something I'm trying to do at Kingsborough is kill dragons, as I like to say. I'm trying to kill this myth somehow that there are things in the world that don't have to do with law. That's not to say that every problem can be solved by filing a lawsuit. But we have something called the rule of law. We have something called, Western liberalism is like all based on law. I'm not really sure how you can escape law. And when you use the word injustice, right, or the research that you're doing about a problem in the world of social relations, again, law is not going to be the only choice you have, but it's certainly going to be one of the choices you have. So in this particular student is looking at poverty and the idea of getting rid of poverty. Well, there's a law against poverty. And so, in other words, the government has failed to live up to their own law of eliminating poverty. And it's the second time under the Roosevelt administration and then under the Lyndon Johnson administration. So, the easiest way would be to look at something called tort. It's the same thing if somebody hits you with their car, right? You sue them because they had a duty not to hit you with their car. The government gave themselves the duty to end poverty, which could be simple. I mean, you saw it with the checks, right? They sent out, money to people. They could do that. There's nothing stopping them from sending everybody money. And that could be one possible solution. And in Europe, they call it a universal income. So, that could be your solution. You could say, look, the government said they were going to solve this problem. They didn't solve the problem. It's causing damage, which is obviously causing health damage. It's causing poor people go to jail more. Poor people don't get educated. All these different things. And so, this would be kind of a clear example. And then you just want to be like really super specific. If you're looking at poverty in New York City, then you want to start with, back to the actor network model, you want to start with the borough. Right? So which borough are you talking about? So then the person who's in charge of that borough, if it's Brooklyn, it's Eric Adams. That's the first person you're suing. And if that sounds harsh to you, what oftentimes happens in a case like this is that Eric Adams will say, no, it's not me, it's the federal government. And he'll sue on your behalf. He'll sue Donald Trump and the federal government. And so this is kind of, a lot about law when you start a lawsuit is figuring out who is responsible. So if you think like you have an 8-car pile up on the freeway, it's not clear right off the bat who was responsible. So you go to court, you present the evidence, and then you figure out who's responsible. So, this is one of those things I want you to realize. This is like how rich people get ahead, right? They use the court system to enforce violations. And, this is interesting when you think about it because a lot of people think the law is just about crime. In fact, that's like less than 10% of the law. 90% of the law is about property rights, intellectual property rights, and, issues like this, like responsibility towards one another. And so I'm just trying to show you this other side of the law. I also give you an example. If you don't want to go down the lawsuit route, you can actually do something called mediation, and you'd want to kind of think about that. And what this does is it gets people involved, right? So when you sue, you might only have like a couple poor people that you're going to help. When you do mediation, you could have hundreds, thousands, millions. And so what this does is it gets everybody into a conversation about, why haven't they been able to stop this issue of poverty, and what would be necessary. So this might be an idea for you too, for a solution to see, why don't we do a mediation? Why don't we have folks talk to each other, right? That would be a pretty good example, I think. I love this question because I struggle with this myself. I've got a book chapter that's due June 15th, and I'm at that point now where I look at the calendar and I say, I probably shouldn't do any more research. I've probably got enough. I sit down, I start to type, and then suddenly I say, man, I don't know. Maybe I need more research, right? So I'm kind of being funny here, but it's serious. Talk to somebody else. Because when I talk to one of my friends who does research, she'll say to me, Jason, I think you're good. you got enough, right? You're not gonna find everything. That's number one. And two, you don't need to, right? To make your point, to make your argument, you might not need a lot of research. It might become pretty clear that what you're saying is correct. So the way I kind of tend to think about it is, well, what is it we're trying to do? So in our paper, right, we want to find reliable sources, meaning that they're going to get into court. So they're not hearsay, they're relevant, and they're based on experts. They're not just some dude from, who at the same time was talking about NFL quarterbacks. He also has something to say about poverty. Maybe that person has a lot to say, but I mean, I doubt it, right? The two things are just so different, and so they couldn't have formed much specialized knowledge. Donald Trump has a C average MBA from an elite Ivy League institution that his parents paid for him to go to. When he talks about science, I don't need to listen to him. It's not necessary. Same thing for the law. I mean, I don't need to listen to what he thinks about the Constitution or the law. But I would obviously listen to a Supreme Court justice. I would obviously listen to scientists, right, that he appoints. So I think that's like the issue here about reliable sources. The other thing is something called triangulation, right? So the idea is like you have an argument, you have a concept, then somebody else has a different concept. So what you're looking for is the other side of the triangle there, right? So you got 1 point, 2 point, now you need the third point. And that's where I think the field research really comes in. Do an experiment, right? Analyze language, look at documentaries, try and figure out like what's the third point in this conversation, right? That way it's not just an argument. But you want to see like which way is the evidence tending towards. That's kind of the name of this game. And that's what legal reasoning really is which way is the evidence leaning. So it's not like sometimes in the philosophy classes, right? It's like make some ridiculous statement and then support it by your arguments and then destroy your opponent. That's not what law does. Law is more about like, let's organize the information through this particular process called abduction. And then let's try to figure it out together. And so if somebody's quote unquote losing a case, the lawyer, I mean, I know on TV and movies it looks like they don't do this, but in real life they do. They concede and they try to make a deal. They try to make a negotiation. And that's much of what law is it's just negotiating. It's not trying to destroy the other side. So, and you're not a lawyer here, right? You're the legal researcher. So what you're doing is trying to get all the arguments together, put them in the table and see, right, what is going on there. So in my mind, right, I just wanted to I got student responses, documentaries, and then I'm going to look at news footage, right? Which luckily for me, they've been in the documentary, so it's easy to collect. And I'm noticing, right, that your language as students is different than the language that the experts use in the documentaries, and that's different than the media. But the language you use is a lot closer to the media, the news language, than it is to the expert. So that tells me something, right? Tells me that CSI science is wishful thinking is right. It's a correct theory. That TV and the internet mostly appeal to bad information. And that folks that have specialized knowledge, they're not on TV, So this is kind of the big challenge that we have is like if we're going to educate people at the law, it's probably not going to come from Kim Kardashian, right? It's going to have to come from somebody who's spent a long time thinking about the law. And then I think just like this idea of just like know when to stop. So go back to our original, we had an introduction, we got a couple body paragraphs, we got a table, and we're going to have a conclusion, right? So I'm looking at the quality of the work, not the amount of pages that you're able to fill up or the amount of sources you were able to accumulate. So what to put in the table is kind of what you're being graded on, right? But if you look at my table, again, I don't think you need to make it more complicated. So we did this during that first week of class. We just language, symbols, ideology. And remember, ideology is just the mental model. So we can look at the language and we can see what the symbol is. And then from that, we can compare what is it the mental model of the person. And what we want to do is if we see 3 or 4 different mental models about poverty, about life under the sea, about education, about racism, then we know that we have to include those in our actor network theory, right? We have to have language that's going to reach each of these. And that's what abduction is really all about. It's putting it in the form of the negotiation so that we're including everybody in this process, that's the solution that's going to happen. When people say change won't happen, that's because they haven't heard or thought about it from other points of view. When you talk to other people about how change can happen, you suddenly see, oh, I see. It's not going to be easy. Otherwise, it would just happen without you. But you're going to have to be the diplomat. You're going to have to be the person who organizes the folks and helps them see across different lines. I'm going to give you a big example. On a recent talk with other teachers, research professors, I should say, we were thinking about, the big challenge right now is how to do critical thinking when we're not face-to-face and talking with each other and doing peer review and all those things. And I said, well, here's the challenge that I'm seeing that my students are having, that you all are having in this class. And then a teacher from the business department who researches economics, she explained the problem she's having or her students are having. And it was amazing because in her class, they had the quantitative. They were able to make a table, no problem, but they had nothing to say about the table. And then in our class, right, you all have all sorts of things to say, but you're having difficulty putting it into a table. So think about that for a second. You're all basically similarly situated. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that I'm teaching you mixed methods and she's teaching you mixed methods. I started with the qualitative, with the thing to say. What is the story that we're going to tell about this? And that's what you did. And now we're trying to transition to the quantitative, to the table. And she did the opposite. She started with the quantitative and then she moved to the qualitative. So what we're saying, right, is that she and I have mastered the skill of doing mixed methods. You all are struggling with that transition of how to do both. I think it's easy to say why. In lots of classes, you're not being taught this because, let's be honest, those professors aren't research professors. They're teachers. And so they don't do research. So, it's hard for me to imagine that someone who doesn't do research can teach you all how to research. So one question, if you have a research paper assignment, you might ask the teacher, how many research articles have you published? They can probably teach you all sorts of other things. But research is going to be a lot harder. It'd be like going to somebody who doesn't know how to play baseball and saying, can you please teach me how to hit a baseball? So I think this is just the challenge that we're trying to figure out is if you're not getting this in other classes, that means there's only so much that I can do and that she can do. And so again, I'm not grading you on the content, right? I'm not grading you on your ability to move something from left to right. What I'm grading you is what do you do with the table, right? So you're going to put all this language in there that you accumulated. You're going to put the symbols that you found from that, and then you're going to put their mental models. And then you're going to analyze that. So what does that tell you about what you need to do to overcome, right? And this is just to show you that law is more than one thing. It's language, it's symbols, it's ideology, it's a court, right? There's all these different things that you have to think about. And how you choose to put those together, that's really what I'm looking for. What are the choices that you make? So there's just two more slides. And the next one is, it would be awesome if everyone did this, right? And this is something called Comparative Law and Politics. Now, caveat emptor is a Latin legal phrase for buyer beware. So beware. This is the best research. And it's absolutely expected at the transfer college. Student after student after student has emailed me their papers from John Jay saying, how on earth do I do this? And it's I told you. So it's hard. This is hard to do because if I compare, going back to the student that's looking at Nigeria, if I compare Nigeria to Mexico, there's huge cultural differences there. And so, there's different languages. So if I'm analyzing language, that's very difficult, right? If I'm analyzing behaviors, how people behave in public, it's going to be different. And then if I'm analyzing that from the point of view of an American, then that's a third culture. So again, this is the best type of research, in my opinion, and lots of folks would say the same thing. But it's hard, and you have to proceed cautiously. So buyer beware means it's not saying don't buy it. It's just saying, beware. Buy it, but check, right? Make sure that the thing is what you wanted it to be. So when you do comparisons, just be careful, right? We don't want to make overgeneralizations. We don't want to say something like Nigeria is better than Mexico on this, or Mexico is better than the United States, right? Better is probably not the right word. What you could say is there are fewer homeless people in this region of Nigeria, and there are more homeless people in this region of Mexico. One possible explanation could be in Nigeria, folks are allowed to bring their goods to a market without a permit. In Mexico, they have to have a permit, and most of the homeless people don't have permits, something like that. I mean, I'm making that up. But you see how you just want to be careful in how you word it. So just to go back, right? Right now, ideally, you would have finished Part A and Part B. Hopefully you started to think about Part C, and maybe you threw up a table, because then that helps me give you feedback. Then once I get your drafts and I can give you feedback, then it's time to analyze the information, put together your argument, and think about your legal evidence. And for those of you who did the briefing the case, most of you got really good information from those two cases, and I have examples of how I'm using them. I'm going to cut that way down. I put more into the draft than I need. I tend to do that. If you tend to do that, that's okay too, right? Put in more and then cut it down. But, this is just the process of writing a good paper. So in the future, we're just a little bit, we have about a month left, or actually less than a month now. But going into, this assignment, you had about 3 to 4 weeks left. This is where you should be, right? You shouldn't be done with your whole paper. You should be to this point. And so that the next 3 weeks you're spending is just analyzing and applying the knowledge that you've gained. Let's say it takes you 9 weeks to gain the knowledge. Now you've got 3 weeks to apply it. And as long as you just do a little bit at a time, a little bit each week, then you should be fine, and you should, easily get an A. Because you'll follow the rubric right here, right? You would have identified actual human beings with specific government agencies or other non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, right? Different groups. You're going to identify like actual things that can be changed, variables that can be changed. So this is kind of the hardest part, and I'm going to just let you kind of struggle there until we get there together. Some of you have struggled, and then now you got it. And then you need to have a valid method of kind of proving your point, and that's where we're going to be transitioning to. And then you're going to include everything you've learned all in together in just a couple pages. Again, this is the skill called synthesis. Ideally, you would have learned this before you got to this class. After teaching for 10 years and trying to prepare students for the next level, I understand that most of you did not get this. And so that's why we're doing this. I want you to be in the best possible situation when you transfer. And this, again, is good for your brain. So I know it's difficult, but just like going to the gym is difficult, you're exercising your brain. So I'm here for you on the other side, and we'll just kind of keep going through this process.